It was just another Tuesday night, and Gabriel, a delivery driver for a popular food app, was finishing his shift. The rain had been relentless, turning the streets into rivers of water. His phone vibrated, signaling one last order for the night. The address was in a remote part of the city outskirts. Gabriel hesitated for a moment but accepted the order. The extra tip could make up for the trouble of driving all the way out there. The GPS guided him into a rural area, deeper than he had expected. The paved roads transformed into gravel paths, and then into a dirt track, surrounded by trees that seemed to swallow the light from his headlights. His car shook over the rough terrain until the silhouette of an old house finally appeared on the horizon. As he arrived, he observed the house with unease. It was large but visibly run down. The windows were dark, and the porch light flickered intermittently. There were no cars or signs of life. Nevertheless, Gabriel grabbed the food bag and stepped out of the car, feeling the cold and damp air. As he approached the main door, he noticed the wood was rotten, and the steps creaked under his weight. There was no doorbell, so he knocked. He waited, there was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time. Just as he was about to call the customer, the door slowly creaked open a few centimeters. The interior was shrouded in darkness. "Hello?" Gabriel tried not to sound nervous amid the silence. A deep and soft voice responded from the darkness. "Come in, leave the food here." Gabriel hesitated. Normally he would leave the food on the porch, but something in the voice made leaving it outside seem unreasonable. He could barely make out a shadow standing in the doorway, hiding in the darkness. His instincts told him he should leave, but the downpour made him reconsider the idea of returning to his car without completing the delivery. Against his better judgment, he took a step inside. The door closed behind him with a dull creak that echoed through the house. Gabriel's heart began to pound as he looked around. The inside of the house was worse than the outside. The air was heavy with humidity and an unpleasant odor, while the walls showed clear signs of decay. Only a dim light hung from the ceiling, casting long shadows throughout the hallway. "Leave it on the table," the voice instructed. Gabriel slowly moved towards a small table he could barely see. He set the food bag down and turned to leave quickly. But when he tried to exit, the man who had greeted him blocked the way. "I've delivered the order, I'm leaving." Gabriel's voice sounded more nervous than he expected. The man took a step closer, revealing his figure. He was tall, with a cold expression and bloodshot eyes. His posture was tense, and his face showed a strange mix of exhaustion and aggression. "No one leaves here so easily," the man murmured, a twisted smile crossing his face. Gabriel felt panic rising in his chest. Without waiting another second, he pushed the man aside and ran back to his car. The rain kept pouring, drenching him in seconds as he struggled with the keys. Finally, he jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. As he reversed, the headlights illuminated the path ahead. Right at the edge of the forest, a dozen figures appeared under the headlights. They were men, all of them gaunt and hostile-looking, watching the car as Gabriel accelerated. One of them even began walking towards him, but Gabriel pressed the accelerator, the tires skidding in the mud as he sped away. For kilometers, the only sound he heard was the rain pounding on the car's roof. However, something was wrong. Even though he was driving fast, the trees and the landscape remained the same, as if he weren't moving forward. He tried finding another route, but they all seemed to lead him back to the same place. Suddenly, the car stopped. Gabriel looked ahead and, to his horror, saw the same house he had just been at. Fear gripped him as he stared in disbelief. It was impossible that he had ended up back there. The front door opened again, and the man appeared in the doorway, his figure barely visible under the rain. He stared at Gabriel, as if he knew Gabriel couldn't escape. Without a second thought, Gabriel reversed and sped off again, determined to get away. But no matter how hard he tried, he always ended up in front of the same house. He was trapped, unable to find his way back to the city. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. A notification appeared on the screen. "New order, delivery at 9 Maplewood Drive." Gabriel looked up and his blood froze when he saw that the address was the same house. The man, still standing in the entrance, stared at him with a chilling smile. Gabriel knew then that he would never leave. It was close to 11 at night, and Julian had already promised himself that he would stop accepting deliveries so late. But when the notification appeared, it was hard to say no. The order was large, with a good tip, and it wasn't far from his route. With a sigh, he accepted it and entered the address into his GPS. The destination was a house on the other side of the city, just past a stretch of forest that had always given him chills. The road leading there was narrow, with dense trees on either side casting unsettling shadows over the pavement. As Julian's car moved along, its headlights barely cut through the thick fog that had settled on the road. The GPS indicated that the house was about 10 minutes away. Something in the atmosphere felt wrong. He couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but the air was too still. Even the trees seemed closer than usual, as if their branches were trying to reach out to him. He shook his head, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. It was just another delivery. Nothing out of the ordinary. Finally, the house appeared just as the GPS had indicated, but something was off. It was an old 2-story house, barely visible through the fog and surrounded by untended trees. The windows were dark, and the driveway was long, winding through tangled overgrowth. The house looked abandoned. Great, Julian murmured to himself. The last delivery of the night, and it's at a house that looks like it's from a horror movie. He parked the car and grabbed the bag of food, stepping into the damp air. The only sound he heard was the crunch of his own steps on the gravel as he approached the porch. The wooden steps creaked loudly under his weight, and he stopped in front of the door. There was no doorbell, just a rusty iron knocker. He knocked 3 times, hard, silence. He knocked again, harder this time, and finally he heard movement inside. It was a slow, dragging sound like someone struggling to walk towards the door. After what felt like minutes, the door opened just a crack. A single eye watched him through the narrow opening, unblinking. "Food delivery," Julian said, forcing a smile. The door opened a bit more, revealing an older man standing in the dim light. He might have been about 60 years old. His face was lined with deep wrinkles and his eyes seemed empty, lifeless. There was something strange in his expression, as if there was no real emotion behind it. "You're late," the man grumbled, even though the delivery was not late. Sorry, the traffic was terrible." Julian lied, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The man stepped aside silently, gesturing for Julian to enter. Normally, he would have left the food at the door and walked away, but the man's insistent gaze, along with the gesture of his hand, made him feel as though he had no choice. Against his better judgment, he crossed the threshold. The air inside the house was strangely cold, much more than it should have been on a damp night. The smell of mold filled the space, and the bare walls, along with the furniture covered by sheets, gave the impression that the house had been uninhabited for years. "Leave it on the table," the man whispered, his voice barely audible. Julian found a small table near the entrance and quickly placed the bag of food, eager to leave as soon as possible. But before he could turn around, the man stepped too close for comfort. "Are you hungry?" the man asked with a soft, strange voice, as if struggling to remember how to speak. Julian shook his head, taking a step back. "No, I'm fine. I just came to drop off the food." The man then smiled, but it wasn't a normal smile. His lips twisted in a way that made Julian's stomach turn. "Stay a while. Eat with me." Julian's instinct screamed at him to leave, but something in the man's gaze held him still. It was as if he couldn't look away, as if the man's eyes trapped him, pulling him towards something unknown. The atmosphere in the house felt increasingly heavy, as if everything was out of place. "I should go. I have other deliveries," Julian said, forcing his voice to sound calm, even though his heart was racing. The man's smile widened, revealing yellowed and uneven teeth. "No, you don't have other deliveries." Julian blinked, confused. "What?" "You don't have other deliveries. You're done for the night." A chill ran down Julian's spine. He hadn't told the man that this was his last delivery, and there was no way he could have known. He looked around, searching for an excuse to leave. Just as he was about to respond, he heard something. Footsteps. Not just one, but several, coming from upstairs. They were slow and heavy, as if someone or something was cautiously descending the stairs. Julian's breath caught as he stared up the staircase. Shadows moved at the top, figures sliding in the dim light, but he couldn't make out who or what they were. His body froze in fear. "You should stay," the man repeated, his voice sounding stranger, almost melodic. The figures at the top of the stairs began moving downward, but Julian didn't wait to see what they were. He ran to the door, yanking it open and sprinting to his car. His hands shook as he struggled to put the keys in the lock, and when he finally started the engine, he sped away as fast as he could. His heart pounded as he looked in the rearview mirror. The man stood in the doorway watching him leave with that same twisted smile on his face. But what made Julian's blood run cold was what he saw next to him. Several figures, dark shadows, their faces obscured by the darkness, but with eyes glowing faintly in the shadows. They were watching him. Julian didn't stop driving until he was kilometers away. When he finally pulled over, trying to catch his breath, his phone vibrated with a notification. It was from the delivery app. Incomplete delivery. Return to 4112 Hidden Path, the same house. And in that moment, Julian realized something terrifying. He had never told the app that he had left. Luis had been working his usual night shift as a food delivery driver. Like every night, the hours passed slowly, one delivery after another. But he enjoyed the tranquility of the empty streets, the houses illuminated by dim porch lights, or the occasional flicker of windows. However, that night felt different. It was nearly midnight, and he had one last delivery before he could head home. The address was in a neighborhood he didn't recognize, on the outskirts of the city, down a long and winding road flanked by thick forest that seemed ready to swallow everything. The order seemed normal, but the customer's note was a bit strange. Leave the food by the shed. Do not knock on the door. Luis thought the request was peculiar but didn't give it much importance. People often had odd requests. Maybe they didn't want to be disturbed or didn't want their dogs barking. The promise of a good tip made him accept the delivery without much thought. As he followed the GPS directions, the houses started disappearing. The streetlights became scarcer, and the trees crowded both sides of the road, as if trying to trap his car. Finally, he arrived at the indicated address. The canopy of trees overhead completely blocked the sky, leaving the area in complete darkness. The atmosphere was eerie, shrouded in a strange silence. The house was barely visible, more like a shadow in the mist than a solid structure. It was only faintly distinguishable with walls covered in vines and darkened windows, but Luis focused on the shed at the end of the property, barely illuminated by his car's headlights. It was small, made of old weathered wood, showing clear signs of abandonment for years. Luis took the bag of food and walked towards the shed. The air around him grew heavier with each step he took. The night was unnervingly silent. There were no crickets chirping or wind rustling through the trees. Only the sound of his footsteps crunching on the gravel broke the silence. When he reached the shed, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, and the smell of rotting wood surrounded him immediately. He placed the bag on the ground as requested, but something made him pause. Why would someone want their food left there? Curiosity got the best of him. Luis gently pushed the shed door to take a look. At first he saw nothing, just darkness. However, as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he saw a figure crouched in the far corner, motionless. His heart started to race. A sense of danger washed over him. "Hello?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The figure didn't respond or move. Luis felt panic rising and decided to step back. He left the food on the ground and turned to walk back to his car when something in his peripheral vision caught his attention. A movement near the house. His breath caught in his throat. He squinted, trying to see through the fog, and then he saw it clearly. A person standing by one of the windows, motionless, staring at him from a distance. Luis's body tensed. The man didn't do anything, he just stared from the window as if he had been watching him since he arrived. He couldn't make out his face, but he could feel his intense, piercing gaze. Just when he thought the situation couldn't get worse, he heard something behind him. He turned quickly towards the shed, but now the door was completely open, and the figure he had seen inside was gone. Fear gripped him. He ran to his car, feeling as though every shadow was closing in on him. His hands trembled as he fumbled for the keys in his pocket. Finally, he managed to get inside, locked the door, and started the engine. Just before he pressed the accelerator, his phone vibrated. With his heart racing, he looked at the screen, expecting a notification from the app. "You disobeyed the instructions." Luis felt his blood turn cold. How did they know he had opened the shed? He hadn't spoken to anyone, hadn't knocked on the door. Another message appeared almost immediately. "Look up." With his heart in his throat, he lifted his gaze to the rearview mirror. There, standing right behind his car, was the same man he had seen near the house. He was tall and thin, and although his face was partially hidden in the darkness, Luis could make out his pale skeletal hands pressed against the car's rear window. Luis panicked, slammed his foot on the accelerator, causing the tires to skid on the wet gravel as he sped away from the place at full speed. He drove as fast as he could, his heart pounding, and even though he had left the shed behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was following him. Every so often he glanced in the rearview mirror, terrified he would see the man behind him. His phone vibrated again. Despite the fear gripping him, Luis couldn't resist the temptation to look. The message read, "You can't escape forever." With his heart racing, Luis kept driving, but something was wrong. The landscape wasn't changing. It was as if he had entered an endless loop. The bends in the road repeated over and over, and the fog grew thicker as if trying to swallow his car. He looked around, searching for any sign that he was moving forward, but everything looked the same. After what felt like hours, his headlights illuminated something that made his stomach sink with fear. There, right in front of him, was the shed. He hadn't managed to escape. He was trapped. Cold sweat ran down his back as his phone vibrated once more. With trembling hands, he looked at the screen. A final message had arrived. "We knew you would return." Luis realized then that there was no way out of this place. The trees, the fog, everything was working against him. And the feeling that someone was watching him was stronger than ever. He was trapped, and there was no way to escape. It was just after 1 in the morning when Vanessa received the order. A burger and fries from a 24-hour restaurant on the outskirts of the city. She had planned to head home, but the night had been slow, and she thought one last delivery might help make up for the low tips. The address wasn't familiar, but it wasn't too far away, just a little off her usual route, through the countryside, along a road she rarely took. As she drove, the streets grew increasingly desolate, with few lights and no signs of life. Eventually, she found herself on a long, dark stretch of road flanked by dense trees. Her car's headlights barely pierced the shadows as she made her way toward the house. The GPS insisted she was just a few minutes away, but there wasn't a single light in sight. Finally, Vanessa spotted a mailbox with the house number she was looking for. She turned onto a narrow dirt path, her car tires crunching over the gravel as she slowly approached a house almost completely hidden by trees. There were no lights on and no signs of life. The house itself was old and decaying, with peeling paint and broken shutters. The only thing that stood out was a faint glow coming from a second-floor window. Vanessa parked her car and double-checked the address on her phone. She was definitely in the right place. She grabbed the bag of food and stepped out into the cold night air. Something didn't feel right. The house looked abandoned, and yet someone had clearly ordered food. Maybe they were asleep or just didn't want to turn on the lights, she told herself. After all, people could be weird sometimes. She walked up the porch, the wooden steps creaking under her weight. She knocked on the door, hoping to get this delivery over with quickly. There was no response. She knocked again, louder this time, and waited. Still nothing. Looking at the bag of food in her hand, she thought maybe the customer simply hadn't heard her. She pulled out her phone to send a message through the app, but before she could type, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the customer. "Come to the back." Vanessa hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but sometimes people had back entrances, especially in old houses like this. She walked around the side of the house, the crunching gravel beneath her feet echoing as the trees loomed overhead. The back of the house was as run down as the front, with an old wooden door that looked like it hadn't been used in years. She knocked on the back door, her knuckles rapping against the rotted wood, and the sound echoed in the still air. There was no response. Suddenly, her phone buzzed again. The message was brief. "Leave it inside." Vanessa stared at the message, a chill running down her spine. Inside? She was about to leave the food on the doorstep and walk away when she heard a soft creak behind her. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing, just the dense trees and the dark, suffocating night. She looked back at the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. It turned easily, too easily, and the door swung open with a long, heavy groan. The interior was a dark hallway, filled with cold, musty air. Vanessa paused at the threshold, the bag of food dangling from her fingers. She didn't want to go inside. Everything in her instincts told her to turn around and leave. But something, maybe curiosity, pushed her forward. She took a step inside. The hallway was narrow, barely wide enough for her to walk without brushing against the walls. There were no lights, no sounds, just the soft creak of the old wooden floor under her feet. She moved slowly, her eyes straining to see in the darkness. Her footsteps seemed too loud in the eerie silence. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway opened with a creak and a faint, flickering light spilled out. Vanessa froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The light flickered as if it were a candle, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She took a deep breath and forced herself to move forward. The room beyond the door was small, cluttered, filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. In the center of the room was a solitary chair. A thick layer of dust covered the floor, and the air smelled musty. Vanessa entered, her flashlight illuminating the cracked walls. Something felt off. As she circled the chair, her phone buzzed again. "Behind you." Vanessa turned quickly, but the room was still empty. Anxiety gripped her chest as fear flooded her senses. Suddenly, the door slammed shut, making her scream. Her phone dropped to the floor and her flashlight went out. In total darkness, Vanessa groped for her phone, but its screen remained black. Panic took hold of her, and then she heard a slow, deep breathing just a few meters away. Terror paralyzed her. She backed up to the door, trying to open it, but the handle wouldn't turn. Desperate, she pounded on the door and screamed, but her voice barely broke through the dense silence. The breathing continued, now closer. Then, the breathing stopped. The silence was even more terrifying until a soft voice, barely a whisper, broke the stillness. "I've been waiting for you." Vanessa felt the terror choking her. She pounded on the door again, screaming for help, but no one could hear her. The next morning, when her friends returned, they found her phone lying on the common room floor. The last message she had received was still visible on the screen. Room 307. But Vanessa was nowhere to be found. It was supposed to be just another quick delivery, a simple pizza to a residential house. Esteban had been working as a delivery driver for over 3 years, and by now nothing surprised him. Late-night orders, strange customers, odd locations. He had seen it all, or so he thought. That Friday night was unusually quiet. His last order came in at 1:45, just as he was thinking about heading home. The address was in a part of the city he didn't recognize, a place called El Refugio. He entered the address into his GPS and was soon on his way, driving down narrow roads lined with towering trees. The further he went, the more isolated he felt. The street lights disappeared, and the only light came from his car's headlights illuminating the road ahead. The trees grew thicker on either side, creating a tunnel of darkness. Esteban started to feel a strange sensation in his stomach, but brushed it off. It was late, and he just wanted to finish the delivery and get home. Finally, the GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination." Esteban frowned. There was no house in sight, just a long gravel driveway that stretched into the forest. He hesitated for a moment, but assumed the house was further inside, hidden by the trees. It wasn't uncommon for rural homes to be set back from the road. He drove slowly down the gravel path, the trees seeming to close in around him, blocking out the sky. His headlights caught glimpses of old wooden fences, broken and overgrown with vines. The driveway seemed endless, twisting deeper into the woods until, finally, a house appeared. It was an old, decrepit, Victorian-style house with peeling paint and dark windows. Only one light on the porch flickered, casting long shadows across the yard. There were no other signs of life. No cars, no lights inside the house, just the dim, flickering porch light. Esteban parked and grabbed the pizza. As he stepped out of the car, the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. The silence was unnerving. Not even the leaves rustled, nor did the crickets chirp. He approached the porch and knocked on the door. There was no answer. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. He was about to leave the pizza on the porch and walk away when he heard a faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned immediately, expecting to see someone, but there was nothing. Just the empty driveway and the dark trees. The footsteps stopped. His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking the silence. He pulled it out and saw a message from the customer. "Come in. The door is open." Esteban's pulse quickened. His instincts told him to leave, that something wasn't right, but curiosity got the better of him. Maybe the customer was sick or didn't want to be disturbed. He took a deep breath and turned the door handle. It opened with a long creak. The inside of the house was as old and disturbing as the exterior. Dust covered the furniture. Old portraits hung on the walls, and the air had a strong smell of dampness. The hallway was dimly lit by a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, its light flickering erratically. "Hello?" called Esteban, his voice echoing in the quiet. There was no response. He walked further into the house, the wooden floor creaking under his weight. He reached the living room, where an unused fireplace stood. In the center of the room was a table with a note on it. Esteban approached cautiously, the pizza box still in his hand. The note was written in shaky handwriting. "Go upstairs." Esteban's mouth went dry. This was getting too weird. He decided he would leave the pizza and get out, but something caught his attention. A shadow that moved at the top of the stairs. His heart began to race. It wasn't his imagination. He was sure he had seen something, someone, moving. Against his better judgment, he called out again. "Hello, I have your delivery." There was no answer, only the oppressive silence. His phone buzzed again. Another message. "Go up. You'll get paid." Esteban was torn between running away or completing the delivery, but his instinct to finish the job won. He took a deep breath and started up the stairs. As he ascended, the air grew colder. Every step he took made the stairs creak, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. When he reached the top, he saw a long hallway with doors on either side, all closed except for one at the end, where a faint light was coming from. Esteban walked toward the open door, his heart pounding in his chest. He peeked inside the room. It was empty, with just an old canopy bed and a wardrobe. The light came from a small antique lamp on the nightstand. But something felt off. The bed was perfectly made, the room too clean compared to the rest of the house. It was as if someone had been there, waiting. Then he heard it. A soft whisper, almost unintelligible, but it was there. Esteban turned, his breath quickening. There was no one in the hallway, no one behind him. The whisper came again, clearer this time. It was coming from the direction of the wardrobe. Esteban stood still, staring at the wardrobe. The door was slightly open, just enough to reveal the darkness inside. The whisper came once more, and this time it was unmistakable. "Open it." Every instinct in Esteban's body screamed at him to run, to leave the house, to forget the delivery. But something pulled him forward. His trembling hand reached out, grabbed the edge of the wardrobe door, and pulled it open. Inside, there was nothing but shadows. The wardrobe was empty, or so he thought, until a cold hand reached out from the darkness, grabbing his wrist with a freezing grip. Esteban gasped, trying to pull away, but the hand held him firmly. From the shadows emerged a man, pale-faced, with sunken eyes staring directly into his soul. The whisper returned, but now it was right in his ear. "Stay." Esteban yanked his arm free and stumbled back, tripping over the bed. He jumped up and ran out of the room, down the stairs as fast as he could, and out of the house. The cold grip still lingered on his skin. He didn't stop running until he got to his car, slammed the door shut, and started the engine. He sped down the gravel driveway, his heart racing. As he reached the end of the road, his phone buzzed one last time. He looked at the screen, afraid of what it might say. "Next time, don't leave." Esteban never returned to El Refugio. Late nights were always slow, and Antonio had already gotten used to the strange people he met while delivering food. From clients who barely spoke to houses that seemed abandoned. He thought he had seen it all, or at least he thought so. It was nearing midnight, and Antonio was ready to finish his shift when an order appeared on his phone. It was from a sushi restaurant on the other side of the city, in an area he rarely visited. The address seemed unfamiliar, in an old part of the city with large houses built decades ago. The pay seemed decent, so he decided to take it. One more delivery and he would be free. The GPS guided him through winding streets, taking him deeper into a neighborhood that seemed frozen in time. The houses were old, massive, with dark gardens, Many of them were unlit, without any visible signs of life. Streetlights were sparse, and soon the only light came from his car's headlights, casting eerie shadows on the cracked pavement. Finally, he arrived at the house. It was an enormous Gothic-style mansion that loomed in the darkness. Ivy crawled up the stone walls, and the windows were completely dark, except for a faint glow on the upper floor. Antonio parked the car and grabbed the sushi bag, feeling a chill as he stepped onto the gravel path. He approached the main door, an imposing oak structure with intricate carvings. He knocked on the door, and the sound echoed through the night. There was no response. He knocked again, louder this time, but still nothing. Just as he was about to turn and leave the sushi on the porch, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the customer. "Go to the side entrance." Antonio frowned, puzzled. This was already strange. Most people simply opened the door. He didn't like the idea of walking around the side of the house at midnight, but it wasn't the first time he had to leave food in odd places. Sighing, he walked along the side of the house. As he moved, the house looked even bigger, more imposing. The trees around him blocked most of the sky, and the faint moonlight barely lit his path. Finally, he saw the side entrance, a small plain door with a single flickering light above it. He knocked on the door, and it opened slightly on its own, as if someone had left it ajar. Antonio hesitated, peeking cautiously inside. It was dark except for a few dim lights that illuminated a long hallway. He was about to leave the food on the threshold and walk away when his phone buzzed again. "Bring it inside." Antonio's stomach twisted. He knew he should leave, but something urged him to continue. Perhaps the customer was sick or too old to come to the door. That would explain the strange requests. With a mix of caution and curiosity, he took a step inside. The air inside the house was cold and damp. The hallway was narrow, with old wallpaper peeling off the walls. Every step he took made the wooden floor creak beneath his feet. The walls were lined with old portraits of people from long ago, with severe expressions and eyes that seemed to follow him as he walked. "Hello?" called Antonio, his voice bouncing off the emptiness. There was no response. He continued down the hallway, the sushi in his hand, until he reached what seemed to be a small kitchen. In the center of the room was a table with a plate and a glass. The order was for 2 people, but there was no sign of anyone else being there. The house was eerily silent except for a distant dripping sound. He placed the sushi bag on the table, eager to leave. But something caught his attention. On the back wall was a slightly open door leading to what looked like a basement. A faint light flickered from below, casting long, wavering shadows. His phone buzzed again. "Downstairs." Antonio's heart skipped a beat. There was no way he was going into the basement. He was about to leave when he heard a sound. It was almost imperceptible, breathing. It was coming from the basement. Against all his instincts, he took a step toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He could barely see the stairs leading down, but the light flickered as if calling him. He swallowed and took the first step, his hand gripping the railing tightly. With each step downward, the air grew colder. The smell of mold and something else, something metallic, filled the air. When he reached the bottom, he found himself in a small, damp room. There was no furniture, no signs of life, just bare concrete walls and a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering constantly. And then he saw it. In the corner of the room, crouched down, was a man, a large figure with an expression of fury on his face. Antonio froze. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The man didn't move at first, but soon he looked directly at him, his face scarred with a deep gash across his cheek. "What are you doing here?" growled the man in a deep, menacing voice. Antonio stepped back, trying to find the words. I'm just dropping off the food." The man slowly stood up, revealing a large knife in his hand. His movements were calculated, and Antonio knew at that moment that he was in danger. He didn't wait to find out more. He turned and rushed up the stairs, feeling the man close behind him. He could hear the heavy footsteps growing louder. When he reached the top of the stairs, he slammed the door and ran for the exit. The man's footsteps quickened, his breath getting closer and closer. Antonio reached his car, his heart in his throat, and barely managed to shut the door as the man slammed his fist against the window. With trembling hands, he started the engine and sped off, racing down the gravel path. When he reached the end of the path, his phone buzzed one last time. He looked at the screen, dread filling him. "We'll see you soon." Antonio never delivered food in that part of the city again. It was just another Tuesday night, and Jose had been driving and delivering food for hours. It was the usual routine: pick up orders, drop them off, and repeat the process over and over. He liked the job enough. It gave him time to think, and the tips weren't bad. But as the night went on, he started to feel uneasy. His last delivery was strange. The order came in just after 11 at night, right when he was about to log off. The address was on the outskirts of the city, in an area he didn't recognize. He sighed, accepted the order in the app, and typed the address into his GPS. It guided him through side roads, taking him deeper and deeper into an area that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. Trees lined the narrow road, their branches hanging over the street like skeletal arms reaching out into the darkness. The houses became fewer until there were none left. The GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination." But there was no house in sight, only a trail overgrown with weeds that led into the woods. Jose frowned and double-checked the address to make sure it was correct. It didn't make sense. He called the contact number listed on the order, and after a few rings, a man answered. His voice was low, barely a whisper. "Yes, hello," Jose said. "I'm Jose from the delivery. I'm at the address, but I don't see a house. Am I in the right place?" "Yes, you're in the right place. Just follow the trail, you'll see it." Jose hesitated. This didn't feel right, but maybe the house was just hidden behind the trees. He followed the narrow dirt path, his car bumping over roots and rocks. After about 5 minutes of cautiously moving through the forest, his headlights finally illuminated a small cabin hidden among the trees. It looked old, decades old. The wooden walls were warped and weathered by time, and the windows were completely dark. A single light on the porch flickered dimly, casting long shadows on the ground. Jose parked the car and sat for a moment, staring at the cabin while the feeling of unease grew in his stomach. Still, he grabbed the bag of food and stepped out into the cool night air. As he walked toward the cabin, the silence felt unnatural. There was no wind, no sound of animals, only the echo of his own footsteps on the gravel. When he reached the porch, he knocked on the door, his knuckles rapping against the rotting wood. No one answered. He knocked again, louder this time, still nothing. Just as he was about to leave the food on the porch and walk away, the door creaked open slowly. A man stood in the doorway, barely visible in the dim light. He was tall, with unkempt hair and a thin, gaunt figure. "You can come in," the man said, his voice as low as it had been on the phone. Jose stepped back, holding up the bag of food. No thanks. I'll just leave this here," he responded, extending the bag toward the man. But the man didn't move to take it. He just stood there, staring at him, as if waiting for something. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, the man slowly extended his hand, his long, bony fingers brushing against Jose's as he took the bag. Jose shivered involuntarily and quickly turned to leave. Before he could take a step, the man spoke again. "Do you want your tip?" Jose froze. Something about the way the man said it sent a chill down his spine. "No, it's fine," Jose responded hastily. "Really, it's not necessary." "I insist," the man said, his voice colder, firmer. "Come in." Every instinct in Jose's body screamed at him to leave, but something about the man's tone made him feel like he had no other choice. With a sense of resignation, Jose slowly turned back toward the door, and the man stepped aside to let him in. The inside of the cabin was even worse than the outside. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of mold and something else, something metallic, like the smell of old blood. The furniture was sparse and old, covered in dust. In the center of the room was a small wooden table with 2 chairs. A single candle flickered on the table, casting long dancing shadows on the walls. "Sit down," the man said, gesturing to one of the chairs. Jose's stomach churned. He didn't want to sit, he didn't want to be there at all, but he found himself walking to the table and sitting in the chair. The man sat across from him, his face still obscured by the shadows except for his eyes, which reflected the candlelight. Jose forced a smile, feeling uneasy. "Look, man, I appreciate the tip, but I really should go. I have other orders." The man didn't respond. He just stared at him, his eyes unblinking as if waiting for something. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man pulled a crumpled bill from his pocket and placed it on the table, sliding it toward Jose. He looked at it and cautiously reached out to take it. When his fingers brushed against the bill, he felt something wet. He looked closer and his heart began to race. There was a dark stain on the bill, and now his hand was stained with what was clearly blood. Jose jumped back, stumbling and knocking the chair over in the process. "What the hell?" he stammered, backing away. The man smiled for the first time, a slow, twisted grin that revealed yellowed, sharp teeth. "You're not the first to come here," the man whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "And you won't be the last." Jose turned and ran for the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He threw the door open and sprinted to his car without looking back. As he ran, he could hear the man's low, raspy laughter echoing through the night air. He started the car and sped down the gravel path, adrenaline pumping through his body. He didn't slow down until he was far away, kilometers from the cabin. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, his hands were shaking violently. He looked down and saw that he still had the bill in his hand. The blood on it had dried and darkened. That was his last night delivering food. He never went back to that part of the city, but sometimes in his dreams he still hears the man's laughter, followed by a whisper, "You'll come back." Lena had been delivering food for several months, but the night shifts always made her nervous. That night was no different. The evening had been quiet, and she was about to finish her shift when a last-minute order appeared on her screen. It was from a small restaurant on the outskirts of the city, headed to a house in an isolated neighborhood she had never heard of. The address seemed strange, too far away, almost secluded, but the pay was good, and her tiredness made her ignore any bad feeling. She shrugged, accepted the delivery, and headed to the restaurant. The place was almost deserted, the lights dim as she picked up the order, a burger and fries in a plastic bag. Without knowing why, she felt a shiver when she looked at the receipt with the address. The GPS guided her out of the city, down a long, winding road flanked by tall trees. The further she went, the narrower the road became until it felt like the trees were closing in on her. The car's headlights barely lit the way, and the shadows from the branches formed unsettling shapes on the road. After what felt like forever, the GPS announced that she had arrived at her destination. Lena parked in front of a large, dilapidated house that looked like it hadn't been inhabited in years. The windows were boarded up, and the porch sagged as if it were collapsing under its own weight. There were no lights on, no signs of life, just an overwhelming sense of abandonment. Lena double-checked the address. She was in the right place, but it made no sense. How could anyone live there? Just as she was about to leave the food in the car and go, her phone vibrated. It was a message from the customer. "Leave it by the door." Lena looked at the house again. The front door looked like it hadn't been opened in years, but the message was clear. She assumed the customer didn't want to come out so late. Cautiously, she grabbed the bag of food and stepped out of the car. As she walked down the gravel path, a growing sense of unease washed over her. The silence was so thick she could almost hear her own heartbeat. When she reached the porch, she set the bag next to the door, which looked old and splintered. Just as she turned to leave, her phone vibrated again. "Come inside." Lena froze, her heart beating faster. "Come inside?" Something wasn't right. She looked at the message again and again. Why did the customer want her to enter? There were no signs of life, no lights, nothing to suggest anyone was in the house. She couldn't understand it. Her instincts told her to leave, to turn around and never return. But there was something about the message, something in the way it was written that compelled her to stay. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door gently, just to check. To her surprise, the door creaked open slowly as if it had been left slightly ajar. Cold, damp air spilled out, and the smell of mold filled her senses. Lena stood in the doorway looking into the dark interior. She couldn't see much beyond the door, just a hallway that stretched inward, filled with shadows. Her hand gripped the phone tightly as her mind wrestled between curiosity and fear. Finally, she took a step forward, just to see if someone was waiting for her. The inside was even more unsettling than the outside. The hallway was narrow, and the walls were covered with old furniture. The air was heavy, as if it hadn't moved in years. Lena told herself she would just take a quick look and leave immediately, but then her phone vibrated again. "Keep going." A cold wave of terror gripped her. The message was more direct, almost insistent. Against her better judgment, she continued walking down the hallway. Her footsteps echoed in the silence. The creaking of the wood beneath her feet made her feel exposed, vulnerable, The silence in the house was oppressive, an eerie void. At the end of the hallway, a door was slightly open, and a faint light came from inside. Lena approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached the door, she gently pushed it open and found herself in a small room. In the center of the room was a table with 2 chairs. One of the chairs was empty, facing her. On the table was a stack of old photographs, face down. Her phone vibrated again. "Look." Lena's hands trembled as she reached for the photos. With a knot in her stomach, she lifted the first one and turned it over. What she saw made her blood run cold. It was a photo of her taken from inside the house as she stood at the door holding the food bag. Panic started to take over. She quickly looked through the other photos. Each one showed images of her, driving toward the house, getting out of the car, walking up the porch. Someone had been watching her the whole time. But the last photo was the most terrifying. It showed the same room she was in now, but this time the second chair was not empty. A man was sitting in it, his face blurry and indistinct, but clearly staring directly at the camera, at her. Just then, Lena heard a soft creak behind her. The air in the room turned cold. Slowly, she turned her head, her eyes widening with horror. In the far corner of the room, barely visible in the flickering light, there was a man. He was tall and thin, his long, bony arms hanging unnaturally by his sides. His face was hidden in the shadows, but she could feel his eyes on her, watching her. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. Lena backed up against the door, her breath coming fast and shallow. The man took a slow, deliberate step toward her, tilting his head slightly, as if studying her. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The overwhelming sense of terror filled the room. With a burst of adrenaline, Lena lunged at the door, pounding it with all her strength. The wood splintered under her hands, and with one final push, the door burst open. She ran down the hallway, the cold night air flooding in behind her. She didn't look back as she sprinted toward her car. She didn't want to see if the man was following her. She reached her car, fumbling with the keys as her hands trembled uncontrollably. Finally, the engine roared to life and she sped down the gravel path, her heart pounding frantically as she drove away from the house. She didn't dare look back. Her phone vibrated one last time. She glanced at the screen. "We'll see you tomorrow night." It was close to midnight when Ernesto accepted the last order of his shift. He had been delivering food for months, but something about nighttime deliveries always unsettled him. This time, the order was for a house on the outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood he had never been to before. The customer's name, Mrs. Vargas, sounded old-fashioned, and the instructions were even stranger. Knock 3 times and wait. He picked up the order from the restaurant, a simple soup and a sandwich, and headed to the destination. As he drove, the GPS guided him through increasingly dark and desolate streets. The houses in that part of the city were old, many of them with lights off and an air of abandonment. Ernesto glanced at the address again, feeling a shiver run down his spine. His car's headlights cut through the thick darkness as he turned onto a street that felt more like a forgotten path. The house appeared suddenly, large but worn, with peeling paint and windows dirtied by time. There were no other houses nearby, just this one, like a relic from a distant past. Ernesto parked the car and stared at the house for a moment, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. He hated places like this where the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, suffocating in its silence. But work was work, and he had to finish it. He grabbed the bag of food, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. The night air was unusually cold for a summer evening. As he approached the front door, he noticed the garden was overgrown, as if it hadn't been tended in years. He hesitated at the foot of the stairs, taking one last look back at his car. But the thought of completing the job pushed him forward. The door was old, wooden, and faded, with cracks running through it. He remembered the instructions. Knock 3 times and wait. He raised his hand and knocked, the sound of the knocks echoing in the stillness of the night. 1, 2, 3. He waited. The silence was overwhelming. All he could hear was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Just as he was about to leave the food on the porch and go, the door creaked open slightly, revealing a thin sliver of darkness inside. "Hello?" Ernesto called, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response. He peered inside but could not see anything beyond the small crack. Something inside him told him he should leave, that he should put the food down and return to the car. But then, a part of him thought that maybe Mrs. Vargas was elderly, that maybe she couldn't hear him well or move quickly. Against his better judgment, he pushed the door open a little wider and glanced inside. What he saw did not reassure him. The hallway was dark, but he could make out the silhouette of a long corridor stretching into the depths of the house. There was a musty smell in the air, like the place hadn't been aired out in years. "Mrs. Vargas, I have your order," he called again, louder this time. There was still no response. Ernesto let out a nervous sigh. He decided he would leave the food at the entrance and go. But just as he was about to do so, his phone vibrated in his pocket, making him jump. He quickly pulled it out and saw that he had received a message through the delivery app. "Leave the food inside, then go upstairs." Ernesto's heart started to race. Upstairs. He hadn't seen or heard anyone since he arrived, and the house seemed deserted. Everything in his mind screamed that he shouldn't follow the instructions, but something pushed him to continue. He looked toward the stairs that he could barely make out in the dim light. They looked old and dusty. He decided to leave the food on a small table near the entrance and approached the stairs, his heart pounding in his chest. The steps creaked under his weight, and the air grew colder as he climbed. When he reached the second floor, the darkness was even thicker. Only a faint light came from a room at the end of the hallway. The door to the room was slightly ajar, and the flickering light of a candle seeped out. Ernesto felt a shiver run down his spine. He took a step toward the door, and with a trembling hand, he slowly pushed it open. The room was small and almost empty. The only thing inside was a small table with a candle on it, casting dancing shadows on the walls. On the table was a framed photo, the glass cracked with age. Ernesto cautiously approached, looking closely at the frame. His heart almost stopped when he saw the image. It was a photo of him, taken that very night. It showed Ernesto standing in front of the house, holding the bag of food. Just at the moment, he knocked on the door. How was that possible? He hadn't seen anyone. He had been completely alone. The air in the room suddenly felt heavier, oppressive. Just as he was about to turn and run, he heard a creak behind him. He quickly turned his head, but there was no one in the hallway, just the shadows cast by the candle. His phone vibrated once more. With trembling hands, he pulled it out of his pocket. A new message appeared on the screen. "You shouldn't have gone upstairs." Panic seized him. He turned on his heel and ran for the stairs, descending at full speed. He could hear his own footsteps echoing in the house, every creak of the steps echoing in the darkness. When he reached the ground floor, he bolted for the door, throwing it open and sprinting toward his car. He didn't look back as he started the engine and sped down the dark road. His phone continued vibrating in the passenger seat, but he didn't dare look at it. His only focus was on getting as far away from that house as possible. When he finally reached the edge of the city, he stopped the car, breathing heavily. His body was shaking, and his hands could barely grip the steering wheel. He looked at his phone, which displayed one last message. "We'll see you soon." Ernesto never returned to that neighborhood. But every time he worked another night shift, he couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, fearing that something might be following him. It was a typical Friday night, and Roberto had accepted his last delivery for the evening. He was tired but grateful for the extra cash. The order was from a Chinese restaurant, bound for a house in an old secluded neighborhood he usually didn't go to. As he drove toward his destination, the GPS guided him through streets that became increasingly narrow and dark. The houses became more spaced out, many of them dark with an abandoned look. The few streetlights flickered ominously, casting long shadows on the road. Finally, he arrived at the house. It was set far back from the road, an old mansion with peeling paint and broken windows. The only light he could see came from a small bulb on the porch, dimly glowing as if it were about to go out. The house gave him a bad feeling, but Roberto reminded himself that people lived in all kinds of places, and not everyone could afford to maintain their homes. He parked his car and grabbed the food bag. As he walked toward the door, the cold night wind made him shiver. The entrance was in poor condition, and when he arrived, he noticed there was no doorbell, only a bronze knocker shaped like a human face with a twisted expression. Roberto hesitated for a moment, but finally knocked on the door using the knocker, the sound echoing into the silent night. He waited. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, but still, no one came to the door. Just as he was about to leave the food on the porch and go, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was from the customer. "Go around to the back." Roberto frowned. Something didn't feel right, but sometimes customers preferred their food delivered to the back door. Maybe the front door was stuck, or they simply didn't want to use it. With a sigh, he decided to follow the instruction. He walked around the house, with the headlights from his car barely illuminating the overgrown yard. The backyard was just as neglected. Weeds grew everywhere, and an old shed was partially collapsed. The only light came from a single bulb hanging over a back door, so old it looked like it would fall off if touched. Roberto raised his hand and knocked gently. There was no sound from inside, no movement. Then his phone buzzed again. "Come in." The door is unlocked. A cold chill ran down Roberto's spine. This was definitely not normal. Deliveries didn't usually require him to enter the customer's home, especially not one that looked as run down as this, and certainly not at this hour of the night. He hesitated, thinking about leaving the food by the back door and leaving, but something pushed him to turn the doorknob. The door opened easily, creaking loudly as it did, the sound echoing in the stillness. The inside of the house was dark, except for a dim light coming from a room at the end of the hallway. The smell hit him immediately, a mix of mold, dampness, and something else, something darker and metallic. The air was thick and heavy. Roberto stepped inside, his heart beating faster. "Hello?" he called out, his voice almost shaking. "I've brought your food." There was no response. He glanced down the long, narrow hallway, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. The walls were lined with old black and white photographs, the serious, sinister faces seeming to follow him as he moved. It felt like the house had been empty for years, but at the same time something made him feel like he was being watched. He slowly made his way down the hallway. The creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath his feet was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence. Finally, he reached the room where the light was coming from. He cautiously pushed the door open and found a small living room furnished with old, worn furniture. In the center was a coffee table with a single lamp casting a faint glow. He placed the food bag on the table, eager to leave as quickly as possible. Just as he was about to turn around, his phone buzzed once more. The message made him freeze in place. "Look up." Roberto felt terror flood his body. Slowly, he raised his eyes, scanning the room until he saw something he hadn't expected. It wasn't a supernatural figure, but a surveillance camera discreetly installed in one corner aimed directly at him. The lens reflected the faint light from the lamp, and for the first time, Roberto realized that he had been watched the whole time. Panic began to take over his mind. Who was watching him? Why would anyone install a camera in a house that seemed abandoned? His phone buzzed again. With trembling hands, he pulled it from his pocket. "You know too much, you won't leave." The message paralyzed him. Something was very wrong, terribly wrong. Without thinking twice, he turned and ran toward the door, his breath coming in short gasps as fear surged through his veins. He could feel the pressure of the camera's gaze following him as he moved, as if someone were watching every step he took. When he reached the back door, he flung it open and ran for his car. He jumped into the driver's seat, his hands trembling so badly that it took him a moment to start the engine. Finally, the car roared to life, and Roberto sped down the gravel road without looking back. The fear continued to pulse through him as he drove away, putting as much distance between himself and that house as possible. Only when he was kilometers away, back in the well-lit streets of the city, did he dare to look at his phone. There were no more messages. Everything was silent. That was Roberto's last delivery. He never worked as a food delivery driver again, and he avoided that part of the city at all costs. But on nights, especially when the wind howled and the shadows played with the light, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, nor could he forget the camera that had silently tracked his movements. And worst of all, he couldn't forget the final message. "We'll see you soon."